Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. Today is another guest episode, and those always get a disclaimer that I do not take a stance for or against a guest's political views or people they support, but the topics are always something that anybody of any political persuasion can get something out of. Decreasing trust in our political institutions, which can include anything like entities such as the Supreme Court, rules like the legislative process, systems like how we vote, pose a major challenge to the legitimacy of our political system. And when you have declining trust, you have more apathy, anger, strife, sometimes even violence. And that faith in our political system's ability to solve problems may even be at the lowest it has ever been. So how do we restore that trust? And how do we get people to understand the importance of trust in political institutions, however flawed they may be? Well, that's what today's guest, Sherman Tylawsky, is here to discuss. Sherman is the founder of the George Washington Institute, which states that its mission is, quote, to provide hands-on, nonpartisan civic leadership skills for citizens, end quote, and the host of the Friends and Fellow Citizen podcast, which moderates civil discussions about current events and connects American history with contemporary issues. And his experience also includes working on political campaigns, interning on Capitol Hill, and giving a TED Talk. So, let's get some insights on political institutions and how we can fix the broken trust we see today. Please welcome Sherman Tylawsky to the show. Sherman, thanks for coming on. How are you?
Hello, Paul. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I always start with guests by going back to the genesis of their work and involvement in the topic at hand. So before all of this with the Institute and what you're doing now, what initially got you into this arena of political institutions and the trust in them, and why is it so important to you?
Of course. Well, I think with anything, there's always a series of events that occurred in your childhood growing up that influenced you, and it would be the same for me. Growing up, my mother is a first-generation immigrant from Taiwan. She came here to study music and met my dad. My dad is originally from New York. He was a sailor for many years. He was a ship captain, often at sea, but then was able to become a maritime pilot. And growing up, I was always interested in how institutions operate because in many ways, the way I grew up was a combination of very different institutions that produced who I would be later in life and up to today and beyond. And I'll start with the fact that my mom is Buddhist. She's from Taiwan, as I mentioned. My dad is of Orthodox Christian faith and is, of course, from the East Coast and grew up in Florida and upstate New York. And so there already, when I was a kid, I was exposed to a lot of internationalism, you could say, growing up in San Francisco. And with a place like that, there's all different kinds of ways you can interact with people. And, when I started getting into politics, so that's when I really started getting myself exposed to institutions such as media. I remember when I was in high school, I had my first New York Times subscription and subscribed to the Wall Street Journal just to see what was out there, see what it was like to report about the news and how I was consuming that, which, in that development phase is you're still figuring out a lot of things. But I eventually really started getting into politics because, in part because of my background growing up speaking in 2 or 3 different languages. And I wanted to see the world for a bit for myself. And so it's really a series of things. I'm happy to get more into those, integrate those into the conversation as we go. But I was able to do things such as run a congressional campaign earlier this year for the 2nd Congressional District in Nevada. That's interning in Congress a couple of times, as well as for a think tank. And of course, myself, I'm currently a doctoral candidate at the University of Alabama studying political science, and it's all about institutions and foreign policy and all about China and Taiwan policy as well. So just a bit of introduction there. As you can tell, institutions have been a huge fascination for me since I was a kid, and looking forward to just talking more about this today.
It's a very eclectic background, especially, coming from your mom being from Taiwan. And it is interesting to get obviously when you grow up here and you're so politically socialized here, it's one thing, but when you're coming from somewhere completely different and getting the perspective from that has always been fascinating. I don't quite have that. I want to say I'm like fourth or fifth generation, so I don't quite have that perspective, but it's still very interesting to see how people uh, shape that, especially from countries like Taiwan. But you're the founder of the George Washington Institute, and I briefly described what it does in the intro, but I want you to talk about it in your own words. Why did you establish the Institute? What does it do, and what can people get out of checking it out?
First of all, I think George Washington is the best president. So I'm sorry to all the past presidents and current and future presidents out there. They'll never be number one in my mind. I think George Washington represents much of what America is, even what it was back then and what it is today in many ways. So that's the first thing. So it's kind of more of it's a bit of a fandom element there. But the important part of George Washington Institute, as you stated, Paul, which is it's really about preparing civic skills. And mainly it's a speaking platform. I call it a civics platform because the main part, of course, is the podcast Friends and Fellow Citizens, which is the first four words of George Washington's farewell address when he departs the White House after 2 terms. And I remember reading a book about it back when I was at Texas A&M for my master's. And I was just really fascinated about the practicability and the applicability of that speech, given that it's not a legal document as we understand with the Constitution, also was not something like the Declaration of Independence. It was more aspirational, kind of more of the foundational principles. This was very much a speech that is based on Washington's successes, but also failures in a lot of ways of learning about the presidency. If you're the first president of the United States, you're bound to learn something about what the American presidency is, and it certainly helped define it too. That's what I wanted to do with the podcast and ultimately the George Washington Institute. So it's mainly, as I mentioned, speaking platform that is all about passing on skills and ideas, really developing that bridge between Washington, the founding fathers, and the farewell address, that era of American history, bridging that with today and with policymaking and institutions. And so it's very much on what those critical fundamentals are, what we can learn from history, and how everyday citizens can participate. Right? And so there really is a specific element there. I always highlight the farewell address, but we're so incredibly blessed that we hit 200 episodes a few months ago, and it's a combination of interviews with people from all different backgrounds who are sharing how they can relate to the values of the farewell address, whether that be patriotism, civility, fiscal responsibility, and others. And just to have those conversations at a time when I do think a lot of people are longing for authenticity, and they're longing for these kinds of conversation, long form conversations that you, Paul, have done for many episodes. This is on how we get to a better place in our civics. And I'm just really blessed that there are these opportunities to put together a platform that can really benefit all kinds of people. And just looking forward to expand that in different ways in the future. And there's plans in the future, but the point is to always go back to the fundamentals of who we are as a nation and what we can do to improve our country.
Well, congratulations on the 200 episodes, first of all. And I just eclipsed 100 episodes on this podcast actually right around July 4th. It was a very auspicious timing that I did not plan, but
congratulations. And you can hit 200.
Thank you. But I always appreciate anything that's trying to improve civics in this country and from a nonpartisan standpoint. And I think one of the big things with me, obviously, of course, the state of civics in this country, and in some ways it's improving, but it still has a long way to go. And I think one of those things is that adult continuing education. Once people are out of school, all of a sudden there's not a whole lot, it feels like, for adults to really try to hone in on civics, even if they really want to. So this is a neat resource to have for that, and just anything that's out to improve civics. And you talk about the fundamentals, and sometimes even those of us who are in this kind of work for a living, sometimes we forget the fundamentals and we have to go back to it. Or like how I'm a sports guy, a lot of times you got to practice the fundamentals in sports. It's something that anybody can get something out of. But now for the crux of this discussion. So let's dive into the specifics about what we're here to talk about today, this lack of trust in political institutions. How much of this lack of trust is understandable or maybe even justified in your view, and how much would you say is based on misunderstandings or a lack of knowledge about how these institutions work?
That's a great question, Paul. Let me start with a sports analogy since you brought up sports. I love sports as well. I recently read this book. It was sometime last year. It was about Coach Nick Saban, who is arguably the best college football coach in history of the sport. And he wrote a book about leadership. Gosh, it must have been 20 plus years ago. This was back in the time when he was coaching LSU. But he talked a lot about the fundamentals, right, of the sport. And one of the things he often reiterated is you can't look at the scoreboard, right? Because generally like to think that, is there a scoreboard of some kind that we can see, we can track, and see how our institutions are performing? Well, obviously, there's a range of ways you can measure an institution's effectiveness. So the fact that there isn't even one agreed scoreboard, if you like, that is going to pose a challenge. So what is it that you have to do? And so I think going to what Saban was talking about, he always told his teams that focus on getting that first down. It doesn't matter what the last play was. You've got to focus on what you need to do, and you've got to advance that ball. It doesn't matter if you think your other teammates messed up or something. You've got to just focus on what you need to do. And I think that's very much related to this question because I would say for the lack of trust element, I would say it's a combination of both. But I would probably err more on the side of the misunderstanding, the lack of knowledge among leaders and citizenry. I think it's important to know that just to set aside the finger pointing that can be very, very prevalent in our society today, there's a responsibility for everybody. I think that's one of the core parts of civics, right, is that it's about the people. And James Madison once has said that the advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only guardian of true liberty. And Jefferson also talked about the importance of an informed citizenry. And so I think education really is a big part of this, or lack of education is really, really key. Well, one of the things, Paul, I like to share is going back to the lack of trust element. I think lack of trust does stem from the fact that there is misunderstandings because there is an expectation that government or certain levels of government are supposed to solve every single problem out there. And I'll give you an example with the campaign I ran for CD2. One of the things that is interesting is that you're not just running a campaign as a congressional candidate, as if Congress was the only thing that was on the ballot. You're going to events where you have people who are running for district attorney, running for county commission, or for dog catcher, or whatever the position is. Right? There's a bunch of local and state positions that people are running for. And one of the things I always emphasize in my campaign is I always emphasize this idea, particularly when there were issues that related to institutions. So it could be like education, it could be civics, all is the willingness to work alongside people who are elected in local and state positions. I think it's so important to remind people that as part of civics education, we have this system of federalism in our country. And so education, when I say education, it's not just about what we learn in school, about the textbooks and all. It's about what people who are in politics, how they're communicating to the people. And so there really is that, going back to the advancement and diffusion of knowledge, I think that lack of trust really is this lack of diffusion, right? And I think you can go into areas like socialization. What does socialization look like, particularly nowadays with social media and all? So there's always a need, right, to question authority. I do think that lack of trust sometimes can mean that we shouldn't have any. We should have complete trust in institutions. Obviously, it's never going to happen. It's not healthy. I think we need to consistently question authority, but we do need to have those elements of civility, of respect, but also that energy too, right? The energy to argue for your position and to have an open mind and to put yourself out there and realize that, you know what, maybe part of this misunderstanding, lack of knowledge is also on my part. And just having that humility, having that ability to go out there and to share with people that you have much more to learn, I do think is a virtue in and of itself.
Yeah, I usually take the approach of, and I think a lot of those are very good points. I think part of it is just, or when it comes to these kinds of either or situations, it's always like, well, we can take a little bit of both. I mean, some of this lack of trust is understandable just because of, regardless of political views, people who have occupied these institutions have sometimes either overstepped their bounds or they've just not listened to outside voices. They've just thought, they think that they've got everything figured out. And I think that goes to an aspect that often gets overlooked, especially in international contexts, is the people and the institution are not the same thing. The people who occupy these institutions is not the same thing as the institution. Like, everybody hates Congress, pretty much, it feels like. And certainly I have my own frustrations with them time and time again, but you need that institution. Or like how in the international context, a lot of times people talk about how much they hate a specific country. No, it's the country's government that's the issue. And a lot of times when you say that country's government can use that as some sort of propaganda to say, oh, see how much that they hate you because the government tries to make the people think that they're one and the same with the government, and it needs to be some level of separation between those two things. But and something else that you touched on too is, a lot of people aren't really going to the right places for info, and part of that is they just haven't been taught well where to find the info. Some of it is just people just want to find things that confirm what they already believe. And also just government in general is unfortunately very opaque and inaccessible in this country. And there's just so much that we can do to improve upon that. But something that also, just to clear up some things that people may have a misunderstanding of, is just this, in politics, obviously, how you define words matters, and people can try to twist words to mean things that they want. But when it comes to political institutions specifically, do you think that there's a difference between respect and trust? Whether somebody respect an institution but not trust it, or vice versa? And then there's this disconnect where people aren't necessarily on the same page with somebody like one of us saying that we should have some level of respect of these institutions. Do you think that there's a disconnect there?
That's a great question, Paul. And I want to touch upon real quick what you said too about this difference between government and people. And it's just written so clearly on the Constitution, we the people, not we in the institutions. Obviously, the people are going to be a very big role for institutions. But I think I agree with you. I think even as we talk about institutions, it does always go back to the people, because the people are the ones whom institutions should be serving. So I just want to bring that point there. I think that question about trust and respect is really key, because I think the biggest difference there is not practical, but it's more on the emotional difference there. And I just think of, for example, on trust. Trust relies on some element of submission, if you like as in you kind of give a part of yourself or some element of yourself to someone. I just think probably there's a reason why we say in God we trust, not in God we respect. I think trust is a much stronger term in that faith, right? And that deep understanding and deep appreciation and love for something. So I think trust is one aspect. Respect, on the other hand, I think it's more on the practical side, and it definitely is used a lot more loosely as a term as well, because you might see at times when people say, oh, I respect the results, or I respect this. And sometimes people are genuine in that they do respect. They might not like it, but they respect, they have some element of recognition, right? And of giving that person or that result or whatever credibility. And so respect can come and be thrown around. There's some people who might they say it because they feel like they have to say it, but they really don't like how something has occurred. So I do think there's that emotional difference there. What I would also say though is, I guess maybe is a combination of these two, which is I do think both are much needed in institutions, because trust is, and again, like I mentioned, more of the emotional tone there. I don't think that it's entirely a good thing, and very much a good thing to trust an institution fully, because you know that institutions can come and have people who come and go, right? And so, does it really lend to the emotional weight of it to say you trust something? I think we need to trust people who who do believe in us, right? Or people or entities that really have that meaning, right? Whether that be a higher power or that be family, friends, right? Respect on the I think is also important too, because there's going to be a lot of things that we're not going to like about institutions, right? There you could be as maybe someone who is a civil servant in administration. That's a good example. A civil servant, and you serve no matter who's in office. And you might not like the policy, you might not like the way that things are done, but if you have that respect for the institution, you're going to carry it out. You're going to carry it out to the best of your ability for the interests of the country. So there's that element too. I always think too that a bit. I remember going to whenever I go to these museums. The museums always have interesting people in there because they talk about artifacts and what they treasure as, and they look at themselves as stewards, not owners of something. And I think that this really relates to institutions, because when you're a steward, right, you might not like every single thing about an institution, but you understand the significance to posterity. You understand that you are temporarily there. You never can own an institution. You have to run like a relay race and then to pass that on. So just combining trust and respect, I think having some element of those two is important for institutions, but I do think it does depend on how we relate to them, and perhaps maybe a bit more on to the ones who are closer to us. I think trust would be a better word for those.
You've touched on it several times already, but I think it bears repeating, is this idea that we should never, when it comes to anything in politics, I don't think you should ever be unthinkingly supportive of it. Or, I mean, if you do fully support it, at least, think things through. But at the same time, if you're just constantly critical of it, then it might just also be a knee-jerk reaction. But so you touch on another thing, this difference between the emotional and the practical, for lack of a better term. And just like with trust and respect, how you need both the emotional and the practicality. You can't be governed too much by the emotional side, or otherwise it leads to not really well-informed decisions. But also, if you don't have any sort of emotion, then it's just very cold and emotionless, and that's not the way that politics should work either. There should be some level of that human element to it. So, of course, not every institution has the same level of trust or distrust. What are a couple of institutions that you think are still well regarded, and a couple that are particularly maligned? And if you have any thing to add about why you think those are the case, or what exactly they do to earn or maybe not earn those distinctions, what do you think about that?
Absolutely. First of all, when you asked what are a couple institutions that are well regarded, the fact that the vast majority of Americans, including myself and perhaps yourself as well, Paul, the fact that we struggle to think about the institution, that I think has got to be an indication of where we are in terms of the institutional decay that we see in many places, not everywhere. And I think you bring up a good point, a good question to ask: which ones do most Americans still regard very well? I thought of a couple. The first is the military. I think the military as not just an institution of service, of sacrifice. Obviously, you go to any military cemetery, and it's really a touching experience. So certainly, I don't have to describe it too much because everyone can feel it as part of our our country. And so I think the military, particularly, I obviously differ that from, say, the Department of Defense, right? Because that would be in many ways a different institution in that sense, in terms of that's more on the policymaking side. But I think the military and veterans and those kinds of individuals really do have a lot of respect. The other I thought of is civic nonprofits. There are a number of civic organizations, and there's some of them do lean a different way. So I'm not really counting those. I'm talking about the institutions that really promote some element of of active citizenry. I'm think of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. I've seen some of their content, and the people there, they really would just want to promote understanding of the Constitution. There's you can go to other museums or other places that are kind of within those lines there. There's even others that might not be explicitly about some element of activism or civics, but more so just on providing information. So, for example, I'm thinking USA Facts. USA Facts, I've once had the former CEO of USA Facts on there, or operating officer of that, and it's just very reassuring that there are people who are providing something that isn't maybe the most famous thing out there on social media, but it's just essential, right? It's essential to know the numbers so that a person in government or in business or wherever can use that data to make informed decisions. So I'd say those are a couple of the well-regarded institutions. I think I'm Maligned. Well, obviously, this is more of like, gosh, how much time do we have on this podcast? But I'll narrow it down to two that I think are very critical and ones that desperately need repair. I'm talking like 5-alarm fire kind of repair. The number one institutional name is political parties. We have two parties who that really are struggling, even among its within itself, to handle broad tent. I'm not saying that having a broad tent is an easy job for any institution, but there are just too many times in my personal experience and with the experiences of friends and of colleagues of others who feel like, as part of it, if you think of that social contract philosophy out there, people feel like they're not getting their money's worth. They feel like they want to be part of the process of voicing their opinions, of volunteering, or whatever it is, and the party's not giving much back. It goes back to this. It's a bit like fans that of historically bad sports teams. It really does feel, in that some sense, where people, when they see, oh, there's a new season coming up, they don't have high expectations, and they just expect that they're going to perform badly. And what's worse is that these people, these sports fans, they imagine how they feel when a historically bad sports team raises ticket prices or asks them, say, come onto the game and come watch us. That's what it kind of feels like with a lot of these, with our political parties these days. It does seem like fan bases that have teams that just for some reason choke in very, very strange times. So think of whatever team it is and whatever sport you can think of who does that. But I do think there is this inability to govern, inability to resolve factions, inability to relate to a broader electorate. I think that explains why there are many, many Americans who are independent, who don't want to be regarded as a party, and both parties don't seem to get the message. And so that's the first institution there. Second part is Congress. There's a very large concern, and you can see that with whether it's be Gallup or other polls that show this low confidence in Congress. The fact that Congress is competing with cockroaches as in terms of popularity, I think that goes to show that there is a huge disconnect between those who are responsible to govern and those who and people. The people in Congress, of course, doesn't seem like they're very interested in government, because that's the hardest thing compared to, say, posting something bad about someone on social media. And of course, that the people who rightly have high expectations. We need to have high expectations, and yet Congress, it does seem like for many people, including myself and many others, are not meeting up to the representation duties that they ought to uphold.
And I think with Congress in particular, it's even more of a pronounced issue than compared to the White House or the Supreme Court. Because with the White House and Supreme Court, there's a lot fewer people, and we'll definitely get to this in a moment, there's a partisan and ideological bent to people's perceptions of those two institutions. Congress, regardless of who controls it, is always in the dumps when it comes to this level of respect, approval, trust, whatever word you want to use to describe it. Where there's a lot of times it can barely clear like 20% approval. Now, whether approval is a little bit different than trust or respect, it still seems to have a very unique place in terms of maligned institutions. But you do bring up a good point that is the crux, or part of the crux of this discussion, is there are so many institutions that just have such little positive perceptions about them, and it's something that is, well, I obviously if it was easy to solve, we would have already solved it by now, and we could solve it with this podcast. But something you did mention, though, is a lot of it is, I think, sometimes there's this lack of self-awareness by some of those institutions in realizing, the things that are wrong with them, or they realize that the public perception, but the people who are most active in politics, they're the ones that they're answering to, because they're the ones who are having the most impact on elections and so on. But speaking of which, we see partisan and ideological politics permeate so much of our political discussions that it's sometimes hard to separate those genuine feelings about a political institution from what people think about the partisan affiliation of those that occupy the institution, or at least the people who put those people in those institutions. So trust can completely flip based on whether that institution flips between being controlled by Democrats or Republicans, or between liberals and conservatives. How do we deal with that problem of partisan and ideological perception when it comes to trying to restore trust and faith in these institutions? Or at least, what's the first step in doing that?
That's a great question, Paul. I'll start with what Washington mentioned in the farewell address. He warned about factions. It is certainly something that anyone after Washington would have known, and I've just seen the farewell address. So there is the first step, I think, is to recognize that this is certainly nothing new, and certainly what you're talking about, Paul. And that take a look at. I just looked at the Gallup poll for July of this year, 2026, showing that the party difference on confidence in institutions are at a new high. So we are seeing this widening gap. Whether or not that is new is hard to tell, because of the fact that we didn't have Gallup and all those polling or clear indicators in the early years of our country to show those different as. But we can kind of get some sense. I say the first real instance that we see a very, very contentious and huge partisan difference there is election of 1800, where Jefferson is running against Adams. It is a very, very brutal election, probably one of the most brutal, if not the most brutal election we had, just a year after Washington dies. And it's just hard to believe that I imagine there were a number of people back then who probably were sharing those kinds of concerns about whether or not these institutions could hold. I can think of, for example, 1876, which was a very contentious election, and you had basically by a partisan vote. That is how we get Rutherford Hayes as president. And so I just use a couple examples to show that the first step is recognizing the history, right? Recognizing that there are times when in the present day, we do often like to think, I think it's very justified for people to be scared, because history can be very much an unknown, right? It could be, it's something that covers years and years, hard to sift through. But there's a responsibility, I think, of civic individuals to at least make aware of these elements there. So I think there's that element there. In terms of dealing with the problem of partisanship, ideological perception, trust, and faith, I'd like to highlight a couple things that I think we can at least recognize and perhaps come up with solutions, and probably more on the socialization part. So, the first thing that has been noticeably different in recent decades is this increase in partisan self-selection, which basically means that people are joining groups or forming these networks that are matching some partisanship, right? Some partisan identity. And so you're seeing, for example, urban versus rural. You're seeing young versus old, education attainment, college versus no college. So we're seeing these fault lines within partisanship that is something that it really needs to be recognized. Right? And this is where it does come down to individual choices, but also perhaps within groups of people across America, right? Whether that be in a neighborhood, right? Instead of people just sorting themselves into Democrats and Republicans, right? So how about going out to a baseball game together, right? Or to do the things that to socialize, change behaviors that can erode some of these fault lines there and show that no, people can actively talk about politics. Now, I know that there's that saying that you don't talk about politics or religion or sex, with strangers, or at least with first encounters, or even just habitually. But I mean, I do think there's a risk to that. I think there's a risk of people feeling like they're left out, and that they're left out, and they might even resort to more of this distrust in institutions. The other component, I think, is partisan sorting, where there's an alignment of attitudes, of ideologies that are kind of coming together, and you get, instead of having conservative Democrats, now you have way more liberal Democrats, and so all the conservatives are going to probably go to the Republican Party, and same with the Republican side. You might have more liberal Republicans or centrist Republicans who are now saying that I'm identifying more with the Democrat Party. So that, I think, is going to be a huge risk, because even as political parties struggle, when you have this alignment, it kind of rewards parties for being partisan, if that makes sense. And so the part of the solutions, I think, is to, first of all, realize that maybe ideology, at least in my opinion, ideology needs to have less importance there. I think we do need to move towards how people can be involved in institutions, right? Because ideology is very fixed. It's certainly important, right? You have an ideology, I have an ideology, but the ideology component really, I don't think, extends very well with how we talk politics, because people might not know the difference between liberals and conservatives. People might not realize that you and we might have differences on how we see certain issues, and it's not fair to you or to me to categorize each other in certain boxes. So it's the combination of getting out of these fault lines here, and I say it really comes down to the fundamentals. It comes down to fundamentals on the local level, on how you approach strangers, how you communicate with, I don't know, fellow students in class, or maybe the fact that you need to, when you're with a partisan organization, maybe do something together with the other partisan organization, as we've seen at times with college campuses. So lots to talk about there, but it really does come down to how we make those choices, and how we decide to socialize, and how we decide to spend time with our fellow citizens.
Well, there's a lot to get there, but definitely good points about those things. And one of the things you brought up was, and something that I try to bring up often whenever anything comes to polarization, or any of my discussions come to polarization, is that it has always been there. Like you said, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Federalists and Democratic Republicans going at it in 1876, of course, and during Reconstruction, or leading to the end of Reconstruction, we had a civil war that broke the country in two. Or you mentioned the urban and rural divide. You can arguably trace that back to 1896 with William McKinley and William Jennings Bryan going for the presidency. And it's a simultaneously depressing yet also strangely kind of heartwarming fact that is this that geez, we're always at odds, but at the same time it's look how far we've come despite being at all these odds. But another thing you brought up was that partisan sorting, and there's some of that debate between people who think that it's more people are just becoming more polarized, and some people are saying no, it's not being polarized, it's just that they're being more sorted. But I feel like that's a little bit disingenuous. I think your sorting by definition becomes more or polarized. The parties are becoming more polarized. And like you said, we all have an ideology, and it's important. There's nothing wrong with having an ideology. It's that rigidity and the lack of being able to step outside that worldview is that problem. And you do need a place to talk about politics. There's obviously a time and a place for it. You shouldn't just be able to you shouldn't just talk about it like at any point in time. But like you said, a lot of people do just generally feel left out because they feel like they're not supposed to say anything, and then it just leads them a lot of times to eventually lash out. So for the next question, how much of an impact would improving civics education have on respect and trust in our political institutions? And what are a few things about civics that would need to change to make that happen? And do you think that civics itself is a political institution that has a problem with trust and respect?
I'll start with a quote that was wrongly attributed to Benjamin Franklin for some reason. It seems like a lot of quotes are wrongly attributed to Ben Franklin. And so, but I found that it's actually from a Chinese philosopher. And the quote is, "Show me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn." Those 3 degrees of education, there's a combination there that I think are important, but I really want to emphasize that last part, involve me and I learn. And civics education really does play that huge role in respect and trust because it is practical. You can't really fake civics. I mean, of course, people can go around and say, "Oh, I know about civics," or "I'm very involved," and all. But in terms of civics, you have to do a lot of things, right? And I think that's where civics needs to be more practical and more relatable to how politics changes as well. And I think there are times when we might feel like, and it's understandable that certain people have said, "Oh, traditionally it's always worked this way," and all. And believe me, there are a lot of basic elements of just like, for example, talking about politics in person. That is a core element. But what are some other creative ways that we can make civics a bit more practical? I mean, part of it is, I think, podcasts, right? Podcasts in recent years, I'm really glad that there's been an interest in podcasts because it's long form content in the age of social media, which I think is really, really fascinating. And so bringing some of this creativity, right, involving people, I think is the first step there. One of the things that I'm disturbed by with social media, it's not just the algorithms and whatnot. I think it's the fact that social media is trying to undermine a lot of the role of credentials. I think, for example, so you just think of whatever it could be right wing or left wing influencers, and what they so often do is they do this history lesson. They're like, "Oh, let me tell you about the real history of this and that." And here's the problem: is that they have not done any sort of formal training or have any sort of credentials to discuss these issues, and they certainly don't have the incentive to be impartial or to address both sides. And that, I think, is a really big problem. I do think within civics education, we do need to go back to credentials. Now, it could be difficult because there's also a lack of trust in education institutions, right? And that certainly is something there. But I think in terms of, for example, the fact that if you were to be an airline pilot, you have to license. You have to have a certain number of flight hours. If you are to become a medical doctor, right, you need to have an MD, and you need to show that you have experience, right? I think there are a lot of reasons why we need to have some element of credentials and to start looking at our civics again and impose some high standards. Now, there's certain ways you can do that, but I think formal education is something where I don't think you can fake. I mentioned that I'm in a doctoral program. You can't fake this program. You've got to be able to demonstrate in any sort of program with professors there that you know how to conduct social science. You know how to, I get in some ways have a sense of humility as well, knowing that you're not there to change the world and trying to come up with Sherman's new theory about politics. It's about building on what people have done already and just returning to this element in civics education, not having to reinvent the wheel, but to make that wheel operate indifferently, maybe to kind of, instead of just how we maybe think about how something is traditionally used. Why not experiment and try new ways to get people involved so that people can see, results, they can see the impact that they can have on the local community, and perhaps that might get us to a better place, and perhaps get people to be part of something again, and to not have to, people don't feel like they have to give away their political identity or their vote or whatever to something that they might not care a whole lot about. And it's those things that I think we need to get back to get back to trust and respect, which are never received, they are earned.
Going back to that quote, I can understand why somebody would say that was Benjamin Franklin. It sounds like an incredibly prescient thing that he would say. But it also made me think of, and anybody who's watched several of my previous interviews will be like, oh goodness, he's going to bring this up again. But a previous guest I had, he talked about the trajectory of civics education, because he collected a lot of civics, or he likes collecting old civics textbooks. And I say this so much now, and sometimes I wonder, wait, am I remembering what he said correctly? So I think I am. But basically the idea was that there's been there's been somewhat of a shift from, teaching people their rights and duties as a citizen and involving them as part of our nation's civics and politics, and more towards sort of simple, like, rote facts of this is how government works, and not focusing so much on the citizen's role in politics. And, you're talking about, involving people in something and they'll learn. I think that's such a, there's so much of it is learning by doing instead of just having facts thrown at you. Now, I mean, I love learning about some of these, specific facts, but for a lot of people, there's only so much you can teach them before their eyes glaze over. You have to show them why they should get involved and what benefits they get from being involved and how the system benefits from them being involved. And to the last point you were talking about with these credentials in civics, it is something that is maybe one of the most frustrating aspects of political discussion, is all these people who have deemed themselves as experts about how all of these things work, how these bills work, and they might have some knowledge in those fields, but they're just so tunnel vision biased, or they have a vested interest in painting how things work a certain way. And I think you see that not just from people who are regular citizens or, quote unquote influencers or anything like that. I think you see that from government officials too, who their idea of civics is like a specific vision that they have. And you see left and right both talk about the other one trying to teach people what to think or what not to think, but yet I think they are very guilty of the same things that they're complaining about. But it is definitely something I had thought about. I don't know how I'd go about it or if it's even possible. I kind of would like to create some sort of certificate that says, like, this person's certified in, civics education, or they know what they're talking about in whatever aspects or division of civics curricula there would be. Now, of course, then it's like, well, what do you put in that curriculum? And then there's obviously, that's a whole other discussion, but it is something where, again, it kind of goes back to that whole, we're not necessarily looking at people's credentials. We're just, or too many people are looking at whether they're hearing something that they're predisposed to agree with, as opposed to something that is like, well, you know what? Let me verify that for myself. Let me see people who try to balance issues and viewpoints, and I think that's one of the most important things to address when it comes to improving civics. And so, not talking about a specific institution, and it might be hard to do this, but if you had to convince somebody that was highly distrustful about an institution about the importance of having faith in it, what would you say to them? Or is it not so simple and it's really just a case-by-case situation depending on what the institution is?
Paul, one of the things I always tell people, and some people might find it ironic because I'm studying political science, I've been involved in politics in a lot of ways, but I always tell people that make sure politics is never everything in your life. I think one of the tragedies of our society today is that there are people who have not only just built careers on just being in Congress or just in government, but they think they are so reluctant to give any of that away because they have effectively made that as part of who they are and all. I don't think that is a good thing for our society. I think the founders knew that government is important, but there's a reason why they emphasize the belief in the people, right? The belief in it's. I always say that when I was in the UK for college, Parliament is sovereign over there, so the Parliament basically can do whatever it wants. And I always thought, gosh, if they were to have a constitution, it'd probably be we the Parliament, and nothing against English tea or the great British people out there, but that's the parliamentary system, right? And so I think about how when we say we the people and all, it may seem like a very cliche term, but I think the deeper meaning here is that there needs to be some element of distance between politics, institutions, and our daily lives. I don't think we should let institutions dominate everything about what we do. They are incredibly important, but I think that's the starting point, because if we say, oh gosh, institutions are everything, or we have to get, and then usually institutions, people mean like political institutions, they mean, or government and all. But I don't think that's a good road, but I think that's the first thing. The second point is, I do think it is case by case, as you brought up with the question. I go back to just a really quick story about Washington. One time there were some people building something, and there was a corporal basically telling the soldiers, "Come on, hurry up, tell." Basically, everyone but the corporal is doing anything. And so Washington comes around and he's like, "What's going on?" And the corporal's like, I'm telling what to do. I'm the corporal, right? This is the kind of way that it should be." And the workers are struggling there, and so Washington's like, "Okay, I recognize that you're the corporal," and then he gets off his horse, goes and helps the workers, and they get the job done. And Washington goes back to the corporal and says, "If your guys need any help, just let them know that Washington's going to be there." and it shows that, when part of I think in institutions, we often think that it's all about control, right? It's all about who's in charge, right? But as we've seen over the years, there's a number of people who can play a different role. It's not just the president of the United States. It's not just the governor. It's the people who make up that institution. It's the culture. It's the ways in which people can uphold. It's not really just the written laws. It's the unwritten rules, and it's the norms. And so I think if we look at institutions less as, okay, someone's in charge, so therefore it kind of feels like it's a one person rule. And if you look at it as it's more of a continuation of unwritten rules and practices, then I think people can have a different view of it. And I think the people can realize that, what, maybe there is a way to get involved, but it does take some element of humility, takes a lot of learning. I can tell you right now, Paul, that I'm always learning all the time. And there are times when you do feel like you don't know much about something. You're always learning about Congress, it seems like, or other institutions. That, I think, is a very key role in here. And so I just hope that if people are distrustful, just know that it's certainly happened many times before, and you have an opportunity to maybe not change that institution right away, but you can have some faith in it. And maybe that starts not just faith in other people, but faith in yourself and faith in the people. I do think that with any society, a society can only thrive if it believes in itself and it believes in its capabilities. And that I think is something we need to remind ourselves is that we have a lot more capabilities than we might like to think, but it really is within each and every single individual. And I think everyone from that story of servant leadership, going out there to serve others and not just one ourselves, I think that can start something. You never know.
Such critical points there, and the first one you brought up about how much people's identity is tied up in politics. That was something I meant to bring up in response to a question or an answer that you had given before. Is just there is this disturbing amount of how much people. It's not like I'm Joe Schmo and I happen to be a Republican or I happen to be a Democrat. It's I'm a Democrat first and foremost. I'm a Republican first and foremost. I'm an independent first and foremost. And there was I think it was last year, and it might have been National Governors Association Summit, but Michelle Lujan Grisham from New Mexico, the governor there, and then Governor Cox of Utah, they both talked about that, how and I don't know how much of this is just romanticizing the past and how much of it is legit, but there is a certain truth to this idea that when it used to be a lot fewer people that were their politics was such a critical part of who they are. It was whether they were Republican or Democrat or whatever was maybe item 10 to 15 on a list of things they'd use to describe themselves. And now it's so often one or two, maybe three. And it's just not how things should be. It's important to have that identity, and you shouldn't have that suppressed. It's a First Amendment right after all. But at the same time, where it's just leading basically everything you do, and you're getting in whether the people you involve yourself with, whether it's who you're living with, who you're dating or getting married to, and how much of that is being driven by your political views is just a crazy idea to me, and it's not how things should be. That's how we come up with all these silos that we never break out of. And the last thing you said about institutions not being about control, I think is a very poignant, for lack of a better term, idea to bring up, because there is so much about politics is about winning at all costs. It's a very zero-sum thing. But just because you don't control something, or your people, quote unquote, aren't in control, it doesn't mean that there's nothing you can do. It doesn't mean that there's not some sort of impact you can have. You're not supposed to always win. It was deliberately designed this way so that no single faction overtook all of the others. Everybody has to give a little bit of something, and it's the same thing with these institutions. And if you push back enough on these institutions, even if you're not the ones who are running the show, you a lot of times can still make change happen. And obviously it's a little bit oversimplified, but there's just so much, and not even just in politics, just everywhere, just so much is about you have to win, you have to win, you have to win. And I'm not one to say oh, there's moral victories, but at the same time, we can't let our desire to win everything and to try to be successful at everything completely shatter how we interact with people, and to bog down the system and make it worse. And so I think that's a really great final point you brought up there. So we are running up on time, so I want to ask one final question for you. Every time I have it, for those who are new or returning, I always end guest interviews with a random question of the day. It's non-political, or if it is political, it's still meant to be fun and not super serious. So, Sherman, for you, today's random question of the day is: you get to ban one word from the English language. It can't ever be uttered again. Any attempts to say it are just silent. What is that word you are banning? Or what is a word that you would ban?
Oh man, that's a really good one. Gosh, I'd say, gosh, I gotta say, I don't know. I just have a pet peeve for this word, but it's surely. Like I don't know why, but like every time someone says surely you must know or surely this or that, and I'm like, maybe I should ban it because I would think that after watching the movie Airplane,
Surely you can't be serious.
surely it's like maybe to all the Shirleys out there, we'll
Yeah.
just ban that word, and that way Shirley is just a name. That's the only name out there. I don't know. I just think they're just sometimes words or phrases that people use, and it's like I don't is that really necessary of a word? So I'll just leave it at that. So shout out to Airplane as the inspiration for that to resolve any confusion about the English language. That's all.
I want to say I use that word a whole lot, but hey, some words are just annoying just because there's not necessarily a rhyme or reason. Now, this one definitely has a reason to it. I would absolutely ban the word literally. I would literally ban the word literally. And it's not because people use it incorrectly. Like a lot of that is on purpose. It's meant to be hyperbolic. My problem with it is not that. My problem is when people use it and it's just completely unnecessary to use. Like when people say, I literally took 2 steps to do something. Like, why do you need to say that? There's no, that's a completely unnecessary amplifier. And it just gets thrown into basically like every conversation. I see it everywhere. And it just, I'm so sick of the word. My first order of business become world dictator is the word literally cannot be uttered ever again.
I mean, talk about like a sort. Imagine politicians using that. It's like I literally did this. Oh my gosh! I talk about something that would erode trust in an institution.
Instantly, never getting my vote if you do that. Never happening. I don't care if I agree with 99% of your platform. If you say that word, I'm done with you. But thank you, Sherman, for so much for being on the show. Before we wrap up, any other, obviously I'll put the George Washington Institute in the show notes. Any other links you'd like to share?
Thank you so much again, Paul, for having me. Great conversation. I appreciate what you do with the show, keeping it civil, keeping it active and all. I'll just say, look up Friends and Fellow Citizens. It's available on any podcast app, and we're also on YouTube as well. So just type in those 4 words, Washington's Farewell Address. You'll get the show. And, of course, GeorgeWashingtonInstitute.org. We're also on Facebook as well for our Facebook page with updates and all. So, Paul, again, thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciated our conversation today.
Absolutely. Thank you for being on here. So I will include all those links. I'll put those links in the show notes, and then for my show notes, my other works like my 5-day educational email course about how we can better mitigate toxicity and polarization and how the 5 of the big mistakes that we make in that regard and how we can fix those. My book on Amazon about political independence and why they rarely win elections and how they might become more competitive. My work on medium.com, which I write on from time to time, then my other links, my LinkedIn, Facebook.com page, and my website, paulrader.org, and my email, paulraderwrites@gmail.com. But that will end things here for today's episode. As always, thank you so much for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time.